Okay, so first of all, I wanted to kind of let you know what today will be all about. Here's the agenda before us. I'm just going to give a brief update on some of the work of the Interagency Task Force on the Arts and Human Development. And as many as you know, this ongoing webinar series is an initiative of that federal task force, which includes some 15 agencies, departments, offices, or divisions at the federal level. And the mission of that task force, again, is to catalyze new research opportunities, partnerships, and information sharing to advance public knowledge about the arts' role in human development. And the presentation you're about to hear, I think, is a great example of that synergy. Let me just, before introducing the speakers you'll be hearing from, just point out that we had a task force meeting in person just a month ago, actually, the end of June. And it was highly attended by many good cross-sectional representation of the task force, and we are hoping to get moving on some initiatives you'll see me mention in upcoming slides. But today we'll be hearing primarily from the following. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Marsha Semmel, who's the director of strategic partnerships at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. That's IMLS. IMLS is the sister agency, really, to the NEA, and it's been an extreme pleasure to work with Marsha throughout the development of this task force. She's a great partner, and we're really proud to have her open up this presentation for us. The presentation itself is on digital learning and the Learning Labs project. You'll be hearing today from Mimi Ito, who wears many hats. The one I'll be citing is the fact that she's a professor in residence and John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Chair of Digital Media and Learning at University of California in Irvine. And you'll also hear from Ryan Hill, Director of Digital Learning Programs and the Hirshhorn Museum's U Media Center at the Smithsonian Institution. So, really some great presentation coming up. And then, of course, as I said, we'll be taking Q&A. So just briefly, to recap some of our activities lately, this interagency task force as a whole, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that you might have participated in prior webinars and seen that we had foreshadowed we would be hosting a workshop with the National Academy of Sciences. And that actually has now been, a date has been cemented for that. That's September 14th. That's a public workshop here in Washington, D.C. We're looking into strategies to perhaps webcast it. And it's called Research Gaps and Opportunities for Exploring the Arts' Relationship to Health and Well-Being in Older Adults. And if that's kind of a mouthful, that's certainly true of the topics that will be discussed. This is co-sponsored by NIH, National Institutes of Health, with these partner agencies, as you see here. Steering committee members are pretty impressive members of this committee that are going to help us develop, who are helping us develop the workshop, and we'll be there at the event to ask questions and to move toward, I think, some findings that we think can inform future funding, we would hope, by many of the players here. And just to give you an idea, actually it's going to be chaired by Dr. David Rubin, who's a geriatrist at the University of California, Los Angeles. But to give you an idea of what else has been going on, before I do that, just to kind of walk you through some of the study topics, we actually have kind of broken it out to about 4 general research questions or domains. One has to do with the relationship of arts programs and interventions to cognitive, sensory, and motor skills function in older adults and underlying neural processes. We're also looking at comparative benefits or weaknesses of arts therapies over other behavioral or other kinds of therapies for older adults experiencing declines in a variety of ways, cognitive, sensory, or motor skills. We're also looking at cost-benefit analyses that have been done. So this is really a workshop to gather what is the state of evidence and where can we move from here on these fronts. And finally, looking at the relationship of aesthetics and design factors to health and quality life-related outcomes in this population, particularly in long-term care and assisted living facilities. So like I said, it's a mouthful of a title and indeed a lot of research questions that the group will be considering. And we hope that'll generate a report that might guide funders looking to fill gaps in this much-needed area of research. So lastly, as I said, just to kind of update you what else has been going on, just the first 2 items relate primarily to our agency, the National Endowment for the Arts. We'll be giving presentations at two major events. One is the Grant Makers in Health meeting that will be here in DC in September, as well as Grant Makers in the Arts Fall Conference, which will focus actually on many of these issues about the arts and human development. We'll also, the NEA is, I'm proud to say, is going to be participating in helping to develop survey questions or test survey questions having to do with music exposure and participation in the relationship to human development, early childhood development specifically. This is part of something called the National Children's Study that's co-sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, CDC, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And at our most recent meeting, the one I mentioned of the task force, we discussed progress on a literature review. For starters, going to be focusing on, again, health-related biomedical behavioral health outcomes and what have been discovered in terms of the connection to the arts. So just an initial dive found about 3,000 or more citations in peer-reviewed journals. This is a voluntary literature review conducted by the National Institutes of Health Library. And we're very pleased to say that we're moving forward on more focused questions to get information that will be most useful to not only the NIH but other entities to consider funding opportunities and research in this area. And that we hope to make public some of this initial cut on a new web page that we're developing here on the arts and human development, so stay tuned for that. And next to last, just to point out that September 19th is the next of these public webinars, so if you like this one, I sincerely hope you'll tune in at that time to see our partner then, U.S. Department of Education, talk about a program we've been following very avidly to look at, like this, just like the one you're about to hear, having to do with largely youth and adolescent kind of development issues, but primarily in education in school. So those are some of the items here. Finally, for more information, please contact Fed Task Force at arts.gov or visit this link here. And as I said, we'll be developing a new web page shortly to kind of be a focal point and maybe more efficiently rein all this information together for your benefit. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Marsha Semmel from IMLS.
Thank you so much, Sunil. And I just want to reiterate how excited and pleased the Institute of Museum and Library Services is to be an active member of the Interagency Task Force on the Arts and Human Development. We think the work that Sunil and the other colleague agencies are doing is extremely important and will help crosswalk across a number of domains and encourage us all about research gaps and promising practice. As Sunil said, IMLS is an independent federal agency. We're a sister agency to the National Endowment for the Arts, and we just developed a new strategic plan for the next 5 years where we've got a vision statement that talks about a democratic society where people thrive with broad public access to knowledge, cultural heritage, and lifelong learning. And our mission is to inspire libraries and museums to advance innovation, learning, and cultural and civic engagement. We provide leadership through research, policy development, and grant making. And so again, the work of the task force fits very, very neatly in with our mission. There are more than 100,000 libraries of all types in the United States, and IMLS develops materials and funds programs at all types of libraries. And there are many, many kinds of museums, including art museums, but children's museums, nature centers, zoos, aquariums, and history museums. And we fund all of those types of museums and all sizes. In our strategic plan, which you can download in its entirety at www.imls.gov, we have developed 5 major goals and emphases, and you'll see number 1, which is talking about the fact that learner has to be at the center, and we will support libraries and museums in creating engaging experiences for learners of all ages, which is very much relevant to a project we're going to talk about now, and also the role of the venues, the spaces of libraries and museums as strong community anchor spaces that promote civic engagement, cultural opportunity, and economic value. So we began our work with the MacArthur Foundation, actually even before we developed our strategic plan. We did a project called Museums, Libraries, and 21st Century Skills, which talked about the role of our institutions in promoting such skills as visual literacy, STEM literacy, creativity and innovation, and self-directed, interest-driven learning. And as we were developing our project, we learned about and became very familiar with the MacArthur Foundation's Digital Media and Learning Initiative. We ended up working to plan together on a formal relationship that would fund a series of learning laboratories for teens based on the research that MacArthur Foundation had already funded and on some early adopters funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Pearson Foundation, and other supporters. And those early adopters were the U Media Center at the Chicago Public Library and ArtLAB at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And because we're partnering with the Arts Endowment on this particular initiative, we are going to be hearing both from Mimi Ito, whose research really formed the basis of the work that is ongoing and evolving, and you'll hear from Ryan Hill at the Hirshhorn. We were pleased to announce the project, the formal partnership, at the White House in September 2010 as part of President Obama's Educate to Innovate campaign, and we're working with the Urban Libraries Council and the Association of Science and Technology Centers as our cooperating partners to really make this multi-part initiative go. So the program component has included a national grant competition to fund learning labs for teens in libraries and museums around the country. The grants have been of $100,000 for planning and design, and it's important to the grants to each individual partnership and each individual community-based activity. We are bringing our grantees together 3 times during the 18-month grant period to form a community of practice. And there are many, many events just like this one that occur between these 6-month physical meetings, where we continue to learn about the evolving research base, where we are planning a coordinated documentation and evaluation project so that we can really think about sharing the outcomes of this particular project, and we talk about how these projects will be sustainable. We are having at least 2 cohorts of grantees. The first one was announced last November, and these are the grantees, the 12 grantees in the first cohort. We received applications for the second cohort last June, and those will be announced this fall as well. So I think it's a good time now to introduce Mimi Ito and Ryan Hill, and they're going to be telling you more about the research and the practice that has been evolving, specifically in the early adopter sites. So Mimi, why don't you take over and talk about connected learning?
Great. Thanks so much, Marsha. It's such a pleasure to be part of this dialogue. I feel like my involvement as a researcher in digital media in the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, one of the great things about it is precisely to have these kinds of opportunities to have conversations that really cut across, organizational boundaries that often separate us between funders and researchers and designers and technology makers and people involved in educational practice. So I'm really looking forward to having an interactive session with Ryan and everybody else in the webinar. So what I wanted to do was to give a little bit of background in some of the research and the principles for learning and design that have come out of my involvement with the Digital Media and Learning Initiative before I turn it over to Ryan to talk about some of the innovative work that he's been doing at the Hirshhorn Museum. As we've moved forward in our work, which was originally really driven by a lot of foundational research, we've increasingly been working more closely with different kinds of partnerships like what Marsha has described, different learning institutions, different kinds of practitioners that cut across sort of formal and informal learning institutions. And we've been collectively building on the DML work as well as a much broader body of research and design and practice and innovation to develop a sort of orientation towards learning and a set of design principles for technology and the design of educational programs and spaces around the center of connected learning. And connected learning is really an effort to synthesize sort of and put forward kind of a working model or a set of initial design principles that is a response to this question of, given the fact that our media and information environments are changing really, really rapidly, we have, with digital and network technology, really new kinds of opportunities to lower the barriers of access to information, to self-expression, to creative production, to foster engagement through interactive technologies like digital gaming and other forms of sort of responsive learning systems. How can we leverage these technologies to build new kinds of connections across institutions and sites of learning that can expand access to learning, to engage in creative forms of expression, to diversify both the entry points and pathways that young people can have to learning that's highly learner-centered, that's interest-driven, that's engaged, and socially connected. And so the primary mechanism that we've been exploring as a way of fostering this kind of connected or interest-driven and learner-centered approach is really to say, can we foster a kind of learning that's about building bridges, connections, zones of translation between spheres of learning that are often disconnected in young people's lives. So when we did our research, we found that oftentimes, there were learning institutions like schools, other community and cultural institutions that were very important for opening access to academic achievement, to civic and political engagement, to career and economic opportunity. There was also the sphere of young people's kind of recreational, interest-driven, extracurricular type of activities, which was often very fragmented, very specialized, often niche, usually happening in more private and home-driven kinds of environments or youth-driven environments. And then there was young people's peer culture where they're engaging with their friends in the sort of informal sort of social communication that is so engaging, particularly for teenagers. And the connected learning model is really to say, look, can we foster learning experiences, sort of that zone right in the middle there, where young people are socially engaged, pursuing learning that is centered on their interests and their passions, but also is connected to opportunity that matters for their development, for their transition into those more adult-facing goals and institutions that parents and educators care so much about. So to back up a little bit more, we'll be talking more about sort of the connected learning model later in our discussion today. But I wanted to give a little bit of a sketch of some of the research that led to the model. So a few years ago, together with a large number of collaborating researchers, we wrapped up a study of the Digital Youth Project that was really investigating from a foundational perspective, from a youth-centered perspective, how young people, primarily teens, were taking up new technologies, specifically video games, digital media production, and social media to support learning in more informal social and recreational kind of context, with the idea, the fundamental question being, the landscape of information access and learning has changed so dramatically with new media, and how are young people taking this up and innovating in these more informal kinds of learning activities. And what we found was that there was a really important distinction, what we ended up calling the difference between friendship-driven and interest-driven participation, that differentiated the ways in which young people were taking up learning and social engagement in relation to new media. And we found that by far the majority of young people's engagement fell within the space of friendship-driven participation, which was really a replication of the same sort of social group that young people were engaged in their schools and communities. These were taking place on platforms like MySpace, Facebook, text messaging, and instant messaging, and was really about those familiar behaviors of trying to look good to your peers, get popular, make friends, flirt, get a date, the things that are very familiar from teen peer culture in the cafeterias and locker rooms at school, and that was replicating in really sort of similar ways in the dominant kinds of online social media platforms that young people were engaged in. And young people were engaged in, pretty sophisticated forms of information access, posting, linking, forwarding, also creating media, digital video, modifying photos as part of this everyday friendship-driven activity. But we also found that there was a smaller subset of young people who were taking to different kinds of online platforms and communities to develop new kinds of relationships that weren't the same as what they were necessarily encountering in school, that these were relationships and online communities that were centered on, interests, what we ended up calling geeking out. These are communities that are more knowledge and expertise-centered, where young people are often developing pretty high standards for knowledgeability and skills, and they were often using their peer engagement in ways that fostered learning and development and expertise development, and these communities were often intergenerational in nature. And the online platforms that support these kinds of engagements were quite different than the friendship-driven ones, in that, at the time we were doing our research, LiveJournal was a big influence. Today, sites like Twitter, Tumblr, online forums, these are all sites where young people can access information, relationships, mentorship that is often centered around specific interests and skills. So coming off of this research, we were really focused on youth-driven behaviors, social and recreational behaviors, and we identified these two spheres of the interest space and the peer culture space, the hanging out space and the geeking out space. And we also noticed that there was a space of interface, of overlap between those two domains. So that, for example, a young person who's really engaged in popular culture and hanging out with their friends on MySpace, they were also developing a lot of technical and creative skills through that participation by messing around with technology and media production, like modifying their MySpace profiles or figuring out how to share, edit digital video as part of that social engagement. And often that social engagement and the messing around in relation to that became a jumping off point for young people to discover and explore new kinds of creative interests, new kinds of technical interests that grew out of their peer engagement, but that could lead to a more specialized, interest-driven kind of engagement. And then as we moved from this research to considering, well, now that we know this, what should we do about it? We really introduced this third sphere, this adult-facing sphere that, we call academic, but really is about academic, civic, as well as career-relevant kinds of institutions that open up opportunity for young people. So we know that young people are engaged in their interests. We know that they're engaged in their social peer activity. What would it mean to reach young people where they are in those engagements and connect those engagements more effectively to the kinds of opportunities and pathways that are going to serve young people in building connections to the adult world and developing identities and competencies that are going to help them succeed as adults? And this is where the connected learning model really came from. In the digital youth study, we found a small number of young people who were arriving at connected learning either because they had a really active extracurricular life, school that was really innovative in bringing youth interest into the picture, or they were incredibly passion-driven and resourceful young people themselves. So, one young woman I like to talk about a lot, she was a passionate hobbyist in the area of creative writing, and she really liked fantasy fiction. And she connected with an online group of young people who really fueled each other's learning and expertise in writing. She was part of a fantasy role-playing board where young people interactively write fiction together. But she was very unusual in that she wasn't just about being in this interest-driven peer group and getting good at that, but she took the writing and the learning from that group and used it for college essays. She used it for school assignments, and she must have had teachers who were open and invited her to connect those worlds. So what we found is that young people like Clarissa, this young woman, were a real minority. So even though the opportunity was there, for many more young people to have access to communities of interest that fueled their learning and development in ways that could be connected to opportunity and academic learning. Very few young people were taking advantage of these opportunities, and we really felt that there was a design opportunity on the part of learning institutions, educators, parents, developers of online sites to develop much more intentional kinds of programs that were designed not just to provide content and knowledge and information through networks, but to build environments that were really about connecting these different spheres of learning and building a kind of shared intergenerational space of learning that connected to young people's social and interest-driven engagement. And so I think in the remainder of this webinar, Ryan and I wanted to have a bit of a dialogue about the ways in which we're trying to develop these principles and put them into practice in relation to the learning labs that Marsha has described. Just to give a little bit of background in how the research was initially brought into the design of the UMedia Center in Chicago, which was the first one that opened a few years ago. The designers of the space, which it was a partnership between Chicago Public Library and the Digital Youth Network that Nicole Pinkert had been leading. And Digital Youth Network is a youth digital media production program that is based on a mentorship model where Nicole brings in professionals in areas where there's high youth interest, like spoken word and hip hop or graphic design or music, and creates an environment where young people can develop digital literacy in the context that really speaks to their own interests and identities. And so this was a really unique partnership where the Chicago Public Library was providing space and all the expertise that the librarians bring, and Nicole's team and mentors were coming into the space with their well-developed mentorship program and ways of relating to young people. And it's been tremendously successful. You have over 100 kids, teens coming into the space every day. And the space is really designed so that young people can come and do that kind of social hanging out. There's comfortable sofas. They can play rock band. They can bring food. It's the only space in the library where they're allowed to do that. They can just check out a laptop and be on Facebook. So it definitely supports that sort of hanging out and social behavior. At the same time, there's workshops. There's what they call signature projects, which are programs like creating a literary magazine or a podcast or putting on a spoken word performance where young people get a lot of exposure in a safe and friendly environment, and they get mentorship from peers and adult professionals and librarians in order to gain exposure as well as to deepen an interest that they may already have. And so it's an environment where they can move fluidly between these genres of hanging out and messing around and geeking out with technology. And the mentors, the librarians in the space, the programs in the space are really consciously designed to bridge those three spheres of the social engagement, the interest engagement, and also connection to opportunity. So that's a little bit on UMedia Chicago. I think I'll turn it over to Ryan now to talk about what he and his team at Hirshhorn have been doing.
Thanks, Mimi. So it's great to be here to talk about ArtLAB Plus at the Hirshhorn, but it wouldn't have been possible without Mimi's research, because all of the things that Mimi's been talking about have informed and been kind of the pedagogical basis for how we've been approaching working with our local teens. Just a little bit about ArtLAB Plus. It is in the Sculpture Garden at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in the Smithsonian. It is all free. We're an early adapter of the UMedia. We're the first UMedia Center. We're the first one to be a museum. And so we hope to work as a prototype for how this might be applied in museums, but then what we've been learning is that it's different in every space. One of the things that we've done is because we really wanted to bring in local DC teens, we've also tried to make connections between the programming we do and the art collection we have. So just as the library did with their book collection, we're doing that with our art collection. The idea is that we want to give them access to professional technology, art, artist mentors, and build a community of creators rather than consumers. So that's a really important mission that we have. And then, of course, we want them to be thinkers and engaged citizens, and then go out into the with technological skills into the workforce or into college. Before I kind of talk more about the ArtLAB, I wanted to show a little video. It's a raw little video that is that we do. It's a diary that we shoot every day or almost every day, and this diary is a great example of friendship-driven interests and interest-driven interests and how they operate in a U-Media space. So I'll be able to kind of unpack what you see after you see it. This is only a couple of minutes.
Kick it.
So I mean,
yo! Whoa! Yo, what are you guys doing over here?
We're trying to determine whether we're gonna play truth or dare or what.
Yeah, we were totally like.
There is some serious lounging going on. Let me show you guys what's going on back here, though. It's pretty rad. Hey, so what are you doing?
Messing around with the camera on the screen.
All right, then we got some illustration going on over here. Hey, what are you doing?
I'm doing a live trace of this. I'm trying to get it to look cool.
All right, what are you working on, man?
If I start up a project with Photoshop.
Hey, what are you working on, man?
Doing rough sketches of houses. That's about it. Trying to get the perfect one out, but it's not coming along the way I expected. But that's why it's called a work in progress.
All right. All right, then we got a crew back in the booth back here. Let's check them out, see what they're doing back here. Yo, what are you guys working on back here?
Studio.
Something. Hey, what's up? What's up? Making a song.
Yeah.
Something.
You guys got a sample? Let's hear something.
We're still working. We're still working right now.
All right.
It's creative process and motion.
Come back to me in like a month when my album comes.
All right, so I'm out of here. That's what's going on in the ArtLAB right now.
so what you just saw was Gabriel, one of our mentors, doing this diary of the space. And what you probably saw at the beginning was a group of kids hanging out. And then in the section in the middle of the video, you saw kids messing around. And what those are is activity centers that we set up for kids to mess around in. And then the last part, which was in our sound booth, what you were seeing was actually a sound booth session being done by a teen who's been credentialed to do mixing, to do audio mixing. And so that's a big part of kind of what I can talk about as well, which is if it's teen-centered, it needs the ArtLAB needs to be also in some ways run by teens along with mentors so that there's a shared ownership in it. So this first image I'm showing you here, you see a young man standing and pointing. This is actually a broadcast workshop that was done, but one of the teens that comes to the ArtLAB and has been coming since we've opened, Cole, is actually doing peer-to-peer learning here. So he's a mentor, but he's a teen mentor. And so this idea of handing over the ability sometimes to do to instruct their peers is a big part of what we do. And the next image is of Gabriel, who you met in the video diary. And what's interesting about Gabriel is that as a mentor, they also need to come in with a certain amount of cultural collateral. They need to have the same interests that the teens have, so that there's a sense of those interests being reflected in the mentor, but leveling up and becoming more professional. So while Gabriel here is a fantastic photographer and teaches and does a lot of our photography workshops and works as a mentor with photography, he also is very much involved in the music scene. And when he applied for the job, I thought, okay, he's interesting. But then when I went out to a club and I saw him there taking photographs and completely in his element, I thought, this is exactly what we need. And so here you can see he's with a teen, kind of showing how to work a DJ setup. And the teen already came in with an interest in music, but then the idea is to level them up somehow. So this relationship between adult mentors and professional interests is something that we're really fostering in those relationships. And then the last part is, again, in the sound booth. And the idea is that the professional quality technology allows teens to, again, start to create and to move from being consumers of pop culture to creating the culture. And the way that I talk with my staff about what we're doing is we're creating culture, and we're creating a teen-driven culture, so we really have to hear their interests. We have to really work with where they're going, and even when it comes to events, they have to be involved in ways. And this is a different model for museums to be working with their audiences. So I guess back now to you, Mimi, and then maybe I'm sure some questions will have come up during my talk, and then we'll go back and maybe hear what people have to say about it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I think, you know, what a lot of what Ryan has described and what you see in New Media Chicago and the connected learning effort overall, you know, one thing that's really critical is that it's motivated by a set of social values that are really centered around, you know, environments that are about building more equitable forms of educational opportunity, about full participation so that there aren't bystanders, like everybody has an opportunity to be welcomed and part of the spaces. And it's also about learning that is actually building capacity and building social relationships, social capital and connections that are going to serve young people in their transitions to adulthood. I think it's really important that connected learning be understood not as like a technique for design or a technique for instruction or pedagogy, but really is more fundamentally about these kinds of broader societal goals that we're trying to establish. A lot of times, especially when we're talking about somewhat technology-oriented or technology-driven solutions, I think this gets forgotten. And you know, these this like connected learning as a technique is something that could be, if it's seen purely as a technique, can be seen as, you know, what we're already seeing a lot of privileged young people or highly activated learners pursuing already, in the sense that some of the most sort of effective entrepreneurial and kind of creative forms of learning today are really in line with a lot of aspects of the connected learning model, but there is this broader question in terms of those of us who are involved in the public sector of how we can expand opportunity and access to these forms of more empowered and creative and learner-centered engagement. So that was one thing I wanted to highlight, and I won't go in too much detail into the kind of guiding principles and design features we're developing around connected learning, but we are starting to explore questions as new folks like Brian and his team enter this space of what are the kinds of environments, the sort of designed environments that we can promote as educators and researchers that really foster those points of connection, those hybrid moments, those overlaps that we think are really key to the connected model. And three that we've arrived at that we see as a feature of a lot of environments that are successful in bridging these domains is these three that you see here. One is shared purpose, so that young people and adults are coming together in pursuing a goal that's not simply about the learning outcomes, but that's about accomplishing something meaningful in the world. So this can be, publishing a podcast, or it can be competing in a competition with other young people and youth programs. It can be, forming some sort of civic engagement, civic goal that creates a sense of joint purpose. The other thing that I think is really important for this group, and specifically in arts education, is we found that one of the most kind of productive ways of not only supporting the shared purpose modes of participation is really a focus on production and performance as being, particularly when looking at the digital media space, a really important lever in generating engagement, competency, forms of self-expression, and that digital media tools really expand the space of opportunity here. And then the last one, which is really about leveraging the opportunities that open network informational environments provide for expanding access to these opportunities, is the degree to which we can create environments that aren't tightly bound to institutional locations, that aren't proprietary in terms of content and access, so that you can think of the learning and the learner being at the center of the learning ecosystem in a networked way rather than an institution or an organization. So really concretely, it means, for example, having learning resources that are open access, that can be accessed from home, that can be accessed from school, that can be accessed from a library and a museum, and having social relationships that are available to young people in these different environments in ways that can support and foster their learning, that can help coordinate and link together the learning happening in the different sites that are important to young people's learning in their everyday life. So I think for the remainder of Ryan and our time, we wanted to have a little bit of a dialogue of, again, this is work in progress that we're developing in tandem in an iterative way between the development of the research and the practice in the spaces. But we're starting to arrive, at a set of questions about what constitutes success in the design of these environments, and what we see in terms of youth behavior, in terms of what the community and the environment is fostering. And so this comes out of collaboration that I've been involved in with the Chicago Consortium for School Research, who's been doing research in New Media Chicago, as well as a research team at NYU led by Richard Aram, and specifically a researcher, Kylie Larson there, who's been involved in the New Media work, and the team on the ground in New Media Chicago, in starting to talk to young people about what they get out of their participation in the space, and the kinds of opportunities that they're accessing that they wouldn't have otherwise without a space like New Media. And the three that we wanted to talk about was the idea of a safe environment that's centered on interest development, the ability to discover new interests as well as deepen existing interests, and then connecting to the adult world and the opportunities there. So I wanted to invite Ryan. We've definitely seen these dynamics starting to emerge in New Media Chicago, and I'd be really interested, Ryan, about hearing, what you're learning, what your challenges are in starting up a new space. I mean, maybe we could start with the first one.
Yeah, no, I think, and we've talked a little bit about it just kind of ourselves. I think especially when you're working with underserved audiences, the idea of a safe space is really important, because what that allows to happen is for them to develop an identity that's separate from their school or separate from their neighborhoods and from their family, where it is this great opportunity where they can develop their own interests. And those interests are not judged because they're not, they're not worrying about being cool or fitting in. They're not. It's especially if it's a program that's being done at a museum, the emphasis is on expression, and the emphasis is on everything is fine for you to express. As long as you're using the media in some sort of way. and it's fine for you to, to share that. Now, we can talk about issues of language that comes up a lot with the music, but I do want to say that, there are many other kinds of after-school spaces in Washington, D.C., but the fact that these teens go out of their way to come to a museum and to use this space, they could be going to another place to do Facebook, but the fact that they're coming to this particular place in the middle of a sculpture garden means that somehow they're starting to shift their identity to another kind of environment, and they're seeing alternative ways of being in the world, and the safety of that space allows for those new ways of thinking about themselves and thinking about their interests to develop. It also allows them to create friendships that go across communities. So we have generally in our after-school program, we have a lot of teens from one area, but we often get teens from other areas who come in and who are welcomed in, and there's this great opportunity for them to have a dialogue that way. Yeah. Yes?
Ryan, great. Hi, thank you very much. This is Sunil Iyengar at the NEA. I think several questions have come in, so we'll just move to those, and hopefully some of them will reflect back on this content, which is really interesting. From a research perspective, certainly where we sit at the NEA, this primarily dovetails with some of our own interests. So I'm going to just quickly say now that we will now begin the Q&A portion of today's presentation. As a reminder, please type your questions or comments into the Q&A chat box. And please don't use the hand raise function. As I said, we already have a few. We'll just start with those. And also just to let people know, since we got a couple of comments that someone wasn't able to listen to the video, as we said at the beginning, if you're doing this via phone dial-in, you weren't able to hear the video. But you can actually access all this online. It'll be archived soon and put up on the website, which is arts.gov/research/convenings. So let's start with actually Ryan, a couple of questions for you. One question is, the commenter says, very exciting use of space in the museum, but what, if any, connections are made back to the museum? Collections related or otherwise? That's one question, and I'll give you the other after that.
Okay, I'll try to be succinct because I know we have a short amount of time. We are wanting to expand into the museum. There's plans to expand by the next year. That would be happening in the lobby of the museum and would make a literal connection between the artwork and what the teens are doing. So we would have two spaces, and one of the spaces would be literally physically connected to the museum. We often will we'll often use we'll often use the sculpture garden, or we'll use particular exhibitions as subject matter for workshops that we do. We do a lot of workshops, as well as the teens will come over to the museum now and then with a mentor and use it as a way to practice photography or taping sounds or things like that. So the idea is that the collection is inspiration for programming.
Great, thank you. And another questioner also for you, Ryan, asks, how many professional mentors do you have? How are they funded?
Our funding for the mentors, because it shifts from year to year, to be honest, we have had funding from the Pearson Foundation and funding from the MacArthur Foundation for our staff. So it's been funding that has been outside of the Smithsonian. We have one position that is funded by the Smithsonian, but for this next year it will be all MacArthur. I guess that's pretty blatant, but and how many staff? For summer we had 6. We'll probably have 4 for next year, but we also work with a lot of contractors. And the idea is to have people who can work administratively and as teachers in full-time positions, but the majority of the teaching will be happening with contractors.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's a question for you, Mimi. The question is, how do you plan to track the students that participate in these important programs, museums, libraries, after-school programs, youth media programs, and track alums/impact?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a huge challenge for us on the research side, and this is actually something that my colleague Richard Aram has been leading on more than I have, as well as the Chicago Consortium for School Research. But it is, compared to sort of the classroom-based outcomes research, doing research on these drop-in kinds of centers where you really want kids to be able to come and go and be fluid and bring their friends, and where, the dosage or how frequent kids are being in the space is really variable, as well as what they do in the space, because it's youth-driven. You don't always have control, or you don't have control over it. So it does introduce a whole host of challenges on the research side, and I know at UMedia Chicago, I'd be curious, Ryan, what your thoughts are in terms of documenting learning and outcomes and things like that, and tracking kids over time. There have been, some efforts to do a swiping system to at least get basic attendance, and then, our partners have been involved in interviewing and doing follow-up interviews and surveys at the space. So there are ways of doing this. We're actually working on a national survey that's being led by Bill Penuel at University of Colorado Boulder, which is developing sort of a survey that's really, it's one of the features that we're trying to understand is how we do assessment of the overall health and effectiveness of the environment rather than just the individual outcomes. But we're going to be doing a survey that will look at a range of environments that are related to the connected model, including new media centers, to try to start developing a set of indicators that are much more appropriate and keyed to the informal learning space and interest-driven learning, and that have indicators like what you see on screen here about whether the space is exposing young people to new interests, helping them develop relationships that are about mentorship, and peer relationships that center on interest, and trying to develop a set of indicators that are not focused on content and skills, which is what most educational assessment tends to focus on, but is more about that underlying capacity like social and cultural capital, and their initiative and learning choices that we think are so important for these more 21st century sort of learner-centered, self-directed forms of learning.
And on a
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, go ahead.
And on a day-to-day basis, we actually keep they have to register every time they come into the space, and we're working towards like a swipe system. But when they register, we actually have they each have a history, and that allows us to follow what they check out in terms of equipment, how they've been involved in different sorts of ways. So we're able to kind of keep tabs on each of the individuals that come in through and be able to see kind of where they're leveling up or where their interests are driven by the technology that they check out. And just to get to and also to go back to the mentor thing, there's a lot to talk about there because it's a different model. What I'm finding is that you need more mentors than if it was just a teacher with a classroom, because it's a different kind of learning and it's a relationship building that's very different. So I just wanted to get back to that too. Anyway.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think this would be for you, Ryan. Somebody says, I visited UMedia in Chicago, and from what I saw from the museum video, a lot of what goes on in these spaces is up to the teens. They drive the activities. Do you have any ideas how to foster this? Now, that's a fairly general question, but perhaps you have some comments.
Well, I think that, Mimi's research talks a lot about things to look out for, and gives us a great template to look for and to kind of have us be able to focus. How to foster it is a question that we keep coming back to, both as a staff and then I think all the learning labs kind of ask themselves, because as educators, we see all that socializing and we go, oh my gosh, what are they learning, right? But there's a lot of learning is what you start to see. And even in a workshop environment, there's aspects of socializing and messing around and hanging out and geeking out that all happen even within a contained learning environment. So when you're in a more informal environment, I think it's really just finding out more and more from them what they're interested in and encouraging them to take ownership, which is not an easy thing for teens to do. But once they get excited about something, it's hard to stop them. And I think a lot of times there's a certain amount of trust and patience that has to happen. We have kids that come in and just play football for months, and you're just like, oh, this is ridiculous. But then at some point, they'll all of a sudden show up to a workshop, you know, on Photoshop, or they're all of a sudden, so they're in an environment where there's other possibilities that are happening. They're not in an arcade, or they're not in their living room. They're in a place where if they turn their head, they'll be able to see a screen that's really large while a bunch of people are working in Photoshop, or some other kid is learning how to animate. So they see their peers around them doing what we might say are more geeked out activities, and they know that potential is there. But that's also within a social kind of context. So there's kind of this permission that's allowed. And so it's about creating that ecology of interest that surrounds people who are socializing, but it's also, I think, about the relationship with the mentor, encouraging the teen and finding out which way they want to go. There's all sorts of examples I can give you, but I know that we're limited in time, but just part of it is letting them know that you're there to kind of support them as they grow into a medium that they're choosing, or even just an interest that they might have, or they might share with someone else, because a lot of times it's just getting them together in a group, and then before you know it, they're making plans.
And this is exactly what I think gets to the heart of a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in general across these federal agencies with the arts and human development, looking at sort of these places where you know, interventions work most effectively, where, you know, treating the person in terms of health or education where they live, in a sense, and not solely through kind of institutional methods of the past. So let me just mute this for a moment and turn over to Marsha Semmel, who wanted to say a few words too. Again, Marsha Semmel from IMLS.
Yeah, thank you, Sunil. There was a question around symphony orchestras, and I just want to pick up on a point that Mimi made around not only what happens within a single institution, but interest in making connections across different types of institutions. So the MacArthur Foundation has been funding hives, cooperative learning ventures that cross a variety of different institutions in Chicago and in New York, where, again, these are place-based learning, place-based activities that might have to do with a neighborhood or a city that can happen in a variety of settings. And even our grantees, even though we gave a grant for our learning labs to a single institution, in the case of the Columbus, Ohio Public Library System, Columbus is working with the Columbus Museum of Art, the Wexner Center for the Arts, the COSI Science Center, and their local public broadcasting system. So they're going to be creating a number of these spaces across the 5 institutions. In San Francisco Public Library is working with KQED, the Bay Area Video Coalition, and the Cal Academy of Sciences. So even as the connected learning has a set of principles that operate in a single institution, I think there's some interest in bringing it, taking it across the whole community.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before I turn it over. I think this is a question actually, Mimi, perhaps for you. I just wanted to say that somebody had asked about whether, you know, where to look for funding streams from the Interagency Task Force, and I just have to quickly say that, as an aside, that we are, you know, this is a coalition of various federal agencies who obviously have many full agendas in other areas. However, we've come together with the initial purpose of sharing information collaboratively and even working, as you saw earlier in some of the slides I showed, on projects where we have a common goals, such as literature reviews, gap analyses, and actual studies that we hope will generate future funding opportunities. But in the meantime, if you want to know more about funding opportunities, we'd be happy to share them as we learn of them collectively. Just email fedtaskforce@arts.gov. So the final question is, I work for a symphony orchestra. Do you have ideas or suggestions for implementing connected learning for groups such as mine? That's for you, I think, Mimi.
Oh, that's for me. I was going to say maybe Ryan is better for that. But yeah, no, I think it's one of those things where, you know, this is really getting back to Marsha's point, but it's, you know, and I know different organizations and groups probably have different levels at which they're connecting to other cultural institutions and networks, but I think it's where, you know, is there a way in which, you know, some of these online tools, these self-directed forms of learning that young people are engaged in, these forms of digital media can help connect the dots between different kinds of opportunities, because what we find from a research perspective is that often young people will have a learning opportunity off to the side, like it'll be a music program at school, or it'll be, maybe they're messing around with GarageBand at home or something like that. But then when those things come together, that there can be handoffs between things that are developmentally appropriate for young people at different times, that is when you really see those interests start to thrive, and young people connecting with friends, connecting with experts, connecting with organizations and programs and opportunities and areas of interest. But we find that for most young people, unless they have very entrepreneurial parents, we know those parents who are very aggressive about cultivating young people's interest, developing relationships, paying for expensive programs, that a lot of times when we're talking about expanding opportunity, young people don't have people in those lives who are building those connections. So with something like music, which is something that really requires kind of sustained engagement over time in order to develop a lot of expertise and an identity, I think it's about figuring out organizationally how you can foster those handoffs between, say, an introductory school-based program to a summer camp, after school, all the private music teachers out there who are developing relationships with young people, and something like, a more professional or youth orchestra. That's where I think there's a lot of opportunity to build social networks and environments online that give a lot more transparency and visibility for those kind of opportunities. I mean, my daughter is a violist, and I'm just amazed at kind of the ecosystem of how people do share and connect and know each other and have social networks and social capital, where our music teacher will tell us about a youth orchestra and we'll know the music teacher at school. But not all young people have those kinds of opportunities in everyday life. And if there are ways in which there are online communities and networks, directories that can make those things more transparent, you're seeing that young people are going to sites like YouTube. You're seeing that they're looking online when they're initially exploring an interest. Those are real new kinds of opportunities, I think.
Right. Thank you so much, Mimi. And I want to thank all three of our presenters and speakers, Marsha Semmel, Mimi Ito, and Ryan Hill, and all of you for joining us today. We will have, as I mentioned earlier, this will all be up on the NEA website in archived form. And we hope sincerely you'll join us for the next webinar, September 19th. Thank you very much.